campaign in a coming federal election, most likely within the next 120 days, and are serving as Prime Minister now, with Canadians not being aware of what potential conflicts of interest
What possible conflict would you have, Stephanie? Stephanie, I'm complying with the rules. I'm complying with the rules in advance. Point final.
When he's asked about his assets, he says he doesn't have any conflicts, and he attacks the motives of the ones who are asking the questions. But this really isn't about his style of answering questions that are put to him by the media. The question is, why is he so defensive when he's asked?
Newly minted Prime Minister Mark Carney on the hot seat this week during his trip to Europe, pushing back on reporters asking him if he needs to disclose his assets to counter any questions of conflict of interest. The Tories, as you heard there from their ethics critics, say Carney isn't doing enough to answer those questions. The Prime Minister today said more checks could be put in place as the process plays out. Take a listen.
My assets have been put into a blind trust well in advance of the requirements, so they've been disposed. But what happens is that there's a discussion with the Ethics Commissioner for certain screens around certain issues, and that's a process that is underway. It's a natural process, and of course it's part of the way our system works, and I very much respect the system, and those screens become public as they're developed.
So what's the takeaway from the scrutiny on Mark Carney's assets ahead of an election call? Let's bring in our front bench. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us. He's now a senior business advisor with Dentons. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is here, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park bureau chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. So different tone today, Brian, from Mark Carney, certainly compared to yesterday. Does this issue ultimately, like, if it does speak to something, what is it?
Look, I think this is a case where a lot of things can be true at the same time. One is that he is following the rules, and I think that certainly is something they feel comfortable with and something that makes them feel like they can kind of get through this without necessarily doing anything else, or at least they felt that way. At the same time, the way in which he became Prime Minister is abnormal. It's not the average. It's not somebody that became an MP, maybe even became a minister. It's somebody that went without a seat right into leader of the Liberal Party and then Prime Minister shortly after. And on top of that, he's not the sort of average politician either. I mean, we have to say he appears he has a very successful career. Certainly, when we look at sort of the accolades, you would say that's true. And I'm sure if we saw the assets, we would say, wow, this person's quite accomplished and has done a lot in the private sector. So all of these things are true at the same time. And I think the Tories saying that this is abnormal, that the Prime Minister could become Prime Minister with another mandate and hasn't had to divulge yet. But it's also fair for the Liberals to say, well, we're following the rules. So it kind of points to the idea that this is a bit different scenario in which the person became the Prime Minister and what they did before becoming Prime Minister, being quite successful in the private sector, causing that the rules maybe aren't really fitting the moment. And I think today it felt like he was acknowledging that a little bit. I think that's what it kind of, the tone was a little bit more like, look, we're still in talks with the Ethics Commissioner. Once we have screens that are put in place, I don't know if he committed to that, but it felt like he might share that. So I think that might hopefully, from their point of view, alleviate some concerns of the public. Not sure to alleviate the conservative concerns, though. Yeah,
for the kind of naked politics of it, Tom, certainly Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, was way less combative today. I'm wondering why you think that is, and then also what you think the opposition thinks this speaks to, like what you think they are trying to get at here, bigger picture.
Well, I think that this is all part of a learning process as well. When you're the governor of the Bank of England or the Bank of Canada, you make pronouncements and the journalists write them down and you get a question or two and they move on. But I don't think that Mr. Carney's had that experience before where people are basically saying, yeah, but what if the rules were different? Would you then be in a possible conflict of interest with regard to rules that don't yet exist? And he just throws up his hands and expresses frustration and says, but I'm complying with the rules as they exist. So you can see that you know it's not easy for somebody who's never been in the game. Having been in opposition for far more many years than I was a minister in Quebec. I have to say, I completely understand the game, the way it's being played by the Conservatives. It's a bit of a mug's game, you know. Aha, so you might not be complying with rules that don't exist, eh? Well, we'll show you. So the game is going to be played that way. It's going to be a rough and tumble campaign. It's a learning process for Carney, who's, you know, moving from that felted world of the, you know, the big banks and that financial sector towards the more rough and tumble of the political world. And, you know, welcome to the deep end of the pool. This is politics, and he's going to run a campaign for several weeks, and this is an experience. And I think that the experience sunk in yesterday. At least the people around him said, you've got to clarify that no matter what the rules are, if they do evolve, and you're going to talk about the fact that you're working with the ethics commissioner and you're going to respect the rules, keep insisting on that. And I think that he did okay on that, although the exchanges yesterday were definitely an indication that the politics of this is still a work in progress, even for somebody at his level.
James, what do you think of the politics of this?
Tom talks about rules, and there are two rules about this. One, life is not fair. Number two, when you run for public office and you want the privilege of being the prime minister of the country, there's an opportunity cost, as they say in business. And the opportunity cost for Mr. Carney is that he has to disclose. Putting all of his assets into a blind trust means that it's blind to the public, but it's not blind to him. You know, right before he became prime minister, he does what I think a lot of us do who have assets and investments, is we look at our portfolios and we see where we have risks, where there are opportunities. We look at interest rates, we look at tax liability. I do this once a week or so for about half an hour with my portfolio. That's what responsible adults do. And for sure, Mark Carney has done that. If you want to be the Prime Minister of Canada, the CEO of a G7 country, putting things in a blind trust, that's what you're supposed to do. But frankly, it's not good enough. And it's not his fault that it's not good enough, but it's not good enough. And I think his team knows that. And I imagine that before the campaign starts, likely this weekend, that his team will get together, they will tighten up his messaging, and they'll do the correct thing, which it would be to either divest or to have a full exposure of all this sort of stuff. Because the last time we had a prime minister that had significant private sector dealings was probably Paul Martin. And everybody knew what his assets were. And you could say, well, you could allege that he's making certain decisions or investment decisions or tax decisions because, you know, he's a shipping magnate and this and that. Let that be part of the grist of the mill that constitutes regular politics and all that. But let sunshine rein in and let it expose what any possible conflicts there are so we can talk about them. That's how these democracies have to have an open flow of information if they're going to work.
It sort of feels from a political perspective, Rob, that it is headed in that direction, right? Like over the course of time, likely the political minds around him will say, like, this is how you can diffuse this just by being more transparent about it, because it's his response that really made this a story yesterday.
Well, exactly, Vashti, and this is the problem. I mean, in politics, it's what do they say? Pull the Band-Aid off quickly and deal with a situation. I thought Michael Barrett made a good point this morning that it's almost making it look like there's something that he has something to hide. I don't know if he has something to hide, but his response certainly it makes it look like he does. And I think he was snippy yesterday with reporters, with our friend Stephanie Levitz and Rosemary Barton at CBC. I thought it was unseemly a little bit. I thought he looked like a rookie politician who was thin-skinned. And you know, Tom and Brian and James know this because they've been on the receiving end of the questions from people like me. You have to sometimes grin and bear it, you know, and roll with it. And I think the problem for Mr. Carney is the longer he obfuscates, the longer this continues to be a blood in the water for the Conservatives. And I don't blame them for running with this. The polls are really not good for them. They're trending in a bad direction for the Tories. They need to do something very quickly to turn that around. And I think aiming at Mr. Carney's personal wealth and private investments, that's probably not a bad play for them.